Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. I rose and asked the way to Auchan.
Whom do you seek in Auchan?
Asked the red-headed man. James of the Glens, I replied. At this, the travellers looked closely at me and spoke among themselves. As the lawyer addressed the big man, I realized that I was face to face with Colin Campbell of Glenure, the Red Fox. He turned to speak to me again, and had barely uttered more than a few words when the sound of a shot echoed through the trees, and he fell dead on the road. I turned and scrambled up the mountainside. In an open glade, I had a glimpse of a tall man in a black coat and carrying a long gun. "The murderer!" I cried. "I see him!" I looked back down to the road. A party of redcoats had appeared and, muskets in hand, were already climbing through the trees towards me. I waved at them to hurry, but as I did so, I heard the lawyer shout,
£10 if you take that lad. He's an accomplice, posted here to hold us in talk.
I stood, rooted to the spot. Then a voice said,
"Quick, in here among the trees."
As I dived for cover, bullets were already cracking through the branches, and I found myself face to face with Alan Breck Stewart.
"Come,"
he said, and I followed at a run along the mountainside. Through birch scrub and over bare hillside we ran. We stooped for cover. We crawled swiftly in the heather, and from time to time, Alan stood up and showed himself, so that the soldiers shouted and came even faster in pursuit. I felt I could go no further, but Alan clapped me on the shoulder, and I followed him as we doubled back, higher up the mountain. There was no showing himself to the soldiers this time. At length we stopped, almost at the same place from which we had started. I collapsed as one dead, but the pursuit was already far away in the opposite direction. I was troubled by the thought of Alan as an assassin, but he swore that another man had struck down the Red Fox, and our efforts had been to allow him to escape from the Redcoat Patrol. As night fell, we set off for Auchan and James of the Glens. It was about 10:30 when we arrived. Light streamed from every door and window, and in the glare of torches, we saw men taking hidden weapons from under the thatch and hurrying off into the darkness to conceal them anew. As head of the Appin Stewards, in the absence of the Chief Ardshiel, James was required to organize the hunt for the murderer of the Red Fox. Alan and I were already suspect, and wanted notices would soon be out for us. Weapons were forbidden in the Highlands, and a search for wanted men might find much more. James quickly provided us with a change of clothes, a sword for me, some food, and a little money. Then off we fled into the night, leaving James and his people to deal with the illegal weapons. We went eastward. The country was wild and little inhabited. Several times Alan turned aside to leave news of the murder at lonely houses. And in our haste, he misjudged the way. Instead of being safely in a place of concealment, morning found us crossing the floor of a vast, rock-strewn valley. High mountains rose on each side. I now know that we were in the wilderness called Glencoe. The land was empty of people, but Alan pushed on. With difficulty, we crossed a foaming rocky river. As full daylight came to the glen, we found a makeshift hiding place in the shallow hollow where the tops of two huge boulders leaned towards each other. 20 feet above the ground, we were safe from redcoat eyes on the valley floor. We prayed that no watchers would be placed on the surrounding mountains. Throughout a long, blazing summer day, we lay on the burning rock. Shortly after daylight, the soldiers arrived. They made camp half a mile away, and sentries took up positions on the open ground and on rocks almost as tall as our own. Far up the glen, we saw horse soldiers moving to and fro through the heather. We had no water and were tortured with thirst. At one point, we lay, hardly daring to breathe, as a sentry took post directly below us. At last, the sun began to go down. Alan judged that it was safe to descend. and in the cover of the lengthening shadows and the scattered rocks, we crept swiftly and cautiously along the valley floor. At dusk, we reached a stream where we drank deeply and ate some food. Then we were hurrying on, striking upwards onto the mountains and away from the deadly valley of Glencoe. High upon the side of a mountain, we came to a small wooded glen where trout swam in a stream and a cave promised shelter. Alan called it the Heugh of Koroniki. Here we rested for several days. But we could not stay there forever. One night, Alan slipped away down the mountain and left word of our whereabouts with one of his clansmen. We needed above all money if Alan were to reach safety in France. 3 days later, there came a reply. The country was being combed by the redcoats. James of the Glens had been arrested on suspicion, and there was a reward offered of £100 for the capture of Alan and me. The messenger brought not only money, but one of the wanted notices. I was very badly described and unlikely to be recognized, but Alan was already too well known for safety, and for a moment I was tempted to strike off on my own for the lowlands and my own people. The following morning saw us on our way again. We came down from the mountains and onto a desolate moor. There was scarcely any cover, and we were forced to creep from bush to bush, easily visible to any watcher on the surrounding hills. The weather was still hot and cloudless, and our water bottle was soon empty. At noon we rested. Alan took first watch. Then he slept while I sat guard, and I fell asleep. I woke with a start, almost too late. From the southeast, a body of mounted soldiers were approaching. As I watched, they fanned out into an extended line covering about half a mile. Then they began a steady advance, probing the heather with their swords. There was no way we could avoid being taken if we stayed. And if we fled before them, they would ride us down in minutes. Alan woke and summed up the situation.
We must get clear of their line of advance. That mountain yonder to the northeast is Ben Alder. It is a wild, deserted mountain full of hills and hollows, and if we can win to it before the moon, we may do yet.
Already exhausted, we once more fled for our lives. On hands and knees, much of the time, we worked our way across the half-mile of advancing dragoons. Even when evening fell and a distant trumpet recalled the soldiers for the night, we did not stop. The air grew cooler, and a heavy dew refreshed us. But dawn found us numb with exhaustion, still blundering on. Too tired to keep a proper watch, like blind men, we walked straight into an ambush. 3 or 4 wild Highlanders leapt from the heather and pinned us to the ground, dirks at our throats. Alan said something in Gaelic, and immediately we were set on our feet. Under their escort, we again headed for Ben Alder, I with the aid of 2 of the Highlanders, who took an arm each and bore me along as if I were a feather. The lower part of the mountain was thickly wooded. Above the trees, the crags rose sheer, and we found our place of refuge as guests of Clooney Macpherson, chief of Clan Vurich. Instead of fleeing like other Jacobite chiefs, he had remained in his own country. He had a number of hiding places prepared, and now we were ushered into that known as Clooney's Cage. Where the trees grew out at an angle from the rock face, trunks and stout branches had been lashed between them to form a framework. Earth carried up the mountain made a level floor, and the whole structure was thatched and clad with moss to form a house that comfortably accommodated 5 or 6 people. Alan introduced me to the chief as Mr. David Balfour, Laird of Shawes, and we sat down to a hot meal. For this extraordinary house, which looked for all the world like a wasp's nest clinging to the mountain, even had a fireplace. It was formed in a shallow cave, the smoke going unnoticed against the grey rock face above. But even as I sat down to eat, the world spun before my eyes. Terror, exhaustion, and near starvation were having their effect. Cluny's servants put me to bed, and there I remained, only half conscious, for the better part of 3 days. One of the Highlanders, the chief's barber, was actually a doctor by profession. I was put in his care while Alan, whose toughness had enabled him to recover by the end of the meal, spent the time playing cards. On the morning of the 3rd day, I felt well enough to get up. I went to the entrance to the cage. The air felt fresh, and I was eager to be on my way. But Alan seemed worried and somewhat shamefaced, and he confessed that in 3 days of card playing, he had lost what little money we had. Cluny generously offered to return his winnings, and I was glad to accept, but Alan's pride was hurt, and it was in gloomy silence that we left Cluny's cage and set off down the mountain. Our flight from the dragoons had carried us many miles out of our way. Cluny provided us with a guide, who led us first to Loch Ericht, which we crossed by night. He found us a hiding place on the shore of Loch Rannoch, and gave us directions for the remainder of our journey to the lowlands. Alan was still sulking, and became furious when he realized that the route would not only take us from one mountain top to another, but also through Campbell country. He calmed down a little when Cluny's man explained that it was the last place anyone would expect to find 2 suspects in a Campbell murder hunt. We soon lost the benefit of our rest in Cluny's cage. The brilliant summer weather gave way to cold, wind, and rain. Through mist and low cloud we trudged, traveling by night and sleeping on the sodden earth by day. We both grew bad-tempered. We argued as we walked. And finally, we had a furious quarrel over Alan's gambling with our precious funds. In my fury, I drew my sword on Alan, and that brought us to our senses, and we were friends once more.